American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 16, Core Democratic Principles and Public Policy. In this segment, we'll be going over multiple learning objectives. And these learning objectives are, first of all, to list the stages of the public policy making process. Second, to define the component parts of each public policy making stage. And third, understand the policymaker and shaper influence at each of these stages. So first of all, we have to consider the promise of public policy, what it offers to Americans. So first of all, we have to define what public policy is. And it can be defined as a relatively stable, purposive course of action pursued by government officials or agencies. So let's break that down. First of all, the purposive part. That's goal-oriented. It's aiming for something specifically. Secondly, undertaken by government. Government is the only institution that has the authority to decide who gets what and to use coercion to make these decisions binding. And lastly, it assumes a stable process and a time element. So, public policy is the translating of the promise of democracy into the performance of democracy. So the first thing to do to understand this is to break apart policymaking into stages. When we look at the policymaking stages, there are 4 of them. And this is a systematic way, and albeit a bit artificial way, of trying to assess how well public policy is being made. So we look at the stages, first of all, of agenda setting, then policy formulation and adoption, and after that, policy implementation and policy evaluation at the very end. So first of all, let's take a look at the agenda setting stage, which is the very first stage. Now, with the public agenda, what we're looking at is the list of issues on which government can focus. And this obviously is the first and most critical stage of the public policy process. Unless government gets the issues, it doesn't know what to make decisions over. It's also critical in the sense that control over the presentation order influences the choices that people make. Now, this is referred to in the text as Arrow's impossibility theorem. Now, the thing that the Arrow's impossibility theorem suggests is that there is no way the government can determine exactly what policies the public wants. This is because the public oftentimes has varying different policies that they desire, and oftentimes in the rank ordering of these, it leads to situations where, based upon which opportunity, which option is offered first, that will define what follows. So it's not necessarily as rational and easy as we would hope it would be. Beyond that, we have to consider the agenda setters. Now, these are the actors who want to have their interests on the agenda. And obviously, there are those that are inside the government, and we covered that in the first part of the course, which is, the president, the executive branch, Congress, the legislative branch, and the courts, the judicial branch. And obviously, the president has the very most power because he is a singular individual in which there is attention paid directly to him. Now, Congress certainly makes legislation and has an awful lot of authority and can take the incentive, whereas the courts, the judicial system, is more reactive, but certainly it does have the ability to get things on the agenda. Now, outside the government, as we've discussed, the interest groups, the media, and the political parties also have influence as to what shows up on the government agenda. But beyond that, we have to understand that the process of getting things on the agenda can oftentimes be very complex. Now, this refers in the text is referred to as the garbage can model of agenda setting. The idea that within large institutions such as government, decision-making may seem irrational. And here, decision-making results from policymakers finding, and finding is in scare quotes for a reason, finding solutions among previous ideas, tossing them into a metaphorical garbage can, as opposed to the deliberative cost-benefit calculation. And the key thing to consider here, and this is also referred into the book as John Kingdon's policy streams model, is that solutions often are in search of problems. So if someone has a solution, they're going to be looking for any number of problems that the solution might fit into. And certainly the book covers this rather extensively with how ethanol, which of course comes from corn, can be seen as a solution to multiple different problems. Now, the choosing of the issues oftentimes is based upon understanding what gets the public and the policymakers' attention. So there are various different approaches to understanding and having problems brought to one's attention, and this might be indicators. And these are measures that are systematically used to monitor policy, and oftentimes they can be budgetary issues, and we'll see that in a second. Next up, we have focusing events, and these are the events that grab public attention and puts an issue on the agenda as a result. And finally, there's feedback, which is the information that policymakers routinely receive from the public or from constituents and otherwise interested groups. So let's take a look at indicators. And this is governmental budgeting, spending. And as we see, this is just an overall trend line that makes people rather anxious because they're seeing government spending increasing from 1940 to 2017. Now, the key thing to consider here is that while there is an increase, we also have to consider that there are other things that may play a role. So the indicators chosen might influence the perceptions of problems. So federal government spending, once you control for population as well as how much income is in the country, probably flattens this out quite a bit. But that ultimately is a political decision as to which indicators to use. Now, focusing events certainly play a role, and these are very viscerally evocative events which can make people very anxious, scared, angry, any number of strong emotions. And they tend to be highly visual, and we see the images here of Hurricane Katrina, the 9/11 attacks, and then the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And these are all images that when people see them, they get very anxious and they argue that government should become involved, and it puts things onto the governmental agenda to deal with these issues. And there's also feedback, and feedback might be informal, such as constituents stopping by a representative, or it might be more formal, as the case here with House committees and Roger Clemens, an ex-baseball player who was brought in for the use of performance-enhancing drugs. And certainly these are the sorts of things that if it's brought up and we see that this is a problem, and certainly with this and Major League Baseball is seen as a problem, then there might be some governmental actions on this. Now, the next step is considering the actual policy formulation and adoption, which is the next stage in this process. So, government considers various alternatives on issues or problems and formally approve one of them, but the question is, how do they do it? Now, there are two major themes that work here, and we've dealt with this previously. The rational comprehensive decision-making model is one that assumes a rational decision maker, and it suggests that here the decision maker, in other words, we're looking at the policymakers in the legislative branch or the executive branch, make a comprehensive list of alternatives to a problem or an issue. They assess the costs and the benefits for each of them, and then chooses the most effective or efficient based upon rank ordering. Now, this might seem like it's a great idea, but really doesn't happen very often. Indeed, the approach that happens most often is that of incrementalism. Now, this is the approach that involves looking at how similar problems have been solved in the past, identifying alternatives, and they're oftentimes very subtle alternatives, and choosing the one that is the most doable. So what happens here is there are only minor alterations. Now, this means that the changes aren't huge, and so there's something you can move back from if there are failures. And this can be rather effective in the sense that it allows for backtracking and tracing how policies have been changed and what is effective and what is not effective. And it also means that some policies using this approach are more likely to be passed through. Now, this is referred to as the science of muddling through. And what it does is it assumes that humans are imperfectly rational. In other words, they're bounded by the lack of information. And it makes a lot of sense, but there are some problems that are embedded in it. One of the problems is that when you follow along on a path, this means that you aren't considering other alternatives, which might not be beneficial in the long run. And certainly, when we come to the actual implementation of policy, the carrying out of the policy, we see some of these issues. American national government.